This is from a book called The Incarnation. There are a number of editors, Davis, Kendall, and O'Collins. And also in the book, there are articles written by a number of different people. Okay, one of the articles was written by Alan Segal, an Orthodox Jew, well known for his book, Two Powers in Heaven. But here, what Alan Segal was asked to do in this essay on the incarnation, he doesn't believe in the incarnation. He was asked to contribute a chapter on the Jewish background for the Christian idea of the incarnation. Leading up to his discussion of things in Judaism that are fertile ground for eventual incarnational thinking, he mentions that it is a matter of fact that you do find evidence of Trinitarian thinking. For example, he says, it is at least possible to find a clear precedent in Judaism of hypostases within the Hebrew Godhead. Okay, so remember, he's going to talk about the incarnation, and before he gets to that, he says this much is clear before we even talk about the incarnation. There is a clear precedent in Judaism of hypostases within the Godhead. The word hypostases is a technical way of referring to personal subjects, right? Persons within the Hebrew Godhead. This is a Jew, an Orthodox Jew, somebody who has an otherwise axe to grind against Christianity. He doesn't believe Christianity is true. He even has a book on Paul called The Apostolate and Apostasy of Saul the Pharisee. Right? He's no friend of Christianity. Here is another Orthodox Jew, Daniel Boyarin. He is actually a Talmudic scholar and one of the most astute writers I've ever read, but he's an incredibly well-informed individual. His writings are quite dense. This book itself is pretty simple, but it's called The Jewish Gospels, the Story of the Jewish Christ. Here's what Boyarin says, again, not a Christian, and in fact, an Orthodox Jew. He says the ideas of Trinity, or certainly the germs of those ideas, were already present among Jewish believers well before Jesus came on the scene to incarnate in himself, as it were, those theological notions and take up his messianic calling. Here's Boyarin again. This is in an article that appeared in the Harvard Theological Review called The Gospel of the Memra. He said, speaking with a view to the memra, the logos found throughout Jewish literature, the wisdom literature, the Targums, and so forth. He says, although the official rabbinic theology, which comes later, right? So it's after the time of the Second Temple period, still early, right? Like 2nd century after Christ to 5th century or so. Says, although the official rabbinic theology suppressed all talk of the memra or logos by naming it the heresy of two powers in heaven, both before the rabbis who constructed the Talmuds, Babylonian and Palestinian Talmuds, both before the rabbis and contemporaneously with them, there was a multitude of Jews in both Palestine and the diaspora who held on to this version of monotheistic theology. Notice Boyarin doesn't sloppily conflate monotheism with Unitarianism. Boyarin here says that Jews, prior to the rabbis who constructed the Talmud, and even contemporaneously with them, there were many that still believed this, held on to a version of monotheistic theology that included a belief in the Logos or Memra, a second divine person. And it's not just Boyarin. Here's Peter Schaeffer. I don't like his language. There are other things I don't like in Schaeffer. But in his book, Two Gods in Heaven, he says there's no doubt that the Christianity of the New Testament and the early church fathers of the 1st century CE adopted Jewish monotheism. However, it was not the quote-unquote pure monotheism matured to eternal perfection, but rather the monotheism that had developed in the post-exilic period in the later canonical literature of the Hebrew Bible and non-canonical writings, the so-called Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. So what he's saying here is that some people call pure monotheism Unitarianism. He's saying the Christians of the New Testament adopted Jewish monotheism, but it wasn't that. It was rather the monotheism that one can see developed in the post-exilic period and in the later canonical literature of the Hebrew Bible and non-canonical writings. He goes on, the New Testament took up these traditions that existed in Judaism and did not reinvent, but instead expanded and deepened them. The elevation of Jesus of Nazareth as the firstborn before all creation, the God incarnate, Son of God, Son of Man, the Messiah, all these basic Christological premises are not pagan or other kinds of aberrations. They're rooted in Second Temple Judaism, regardless of their specifically Christian character. Here is Elliot Wolfson, another Jewish person, a scholar of Judaism, now speaking mostly of medieval Judaism. And this is just fascinating because the idea is that the rabbis that came along after the time of Christ had an axe to grind and wanted to suppress all this. But what scholars like Elliot Wolfson point out is that these beliefs in more than one divine person were so firmly entrenched in Judaism that even with all their valiant efforts, the rabbis, the Babylonian rabbis and the Palestinian rabbis who constructed the Talmuds, even they couldn't suppress this. Jews continued to hold on to these later traditions. Here's a quote from him. He says, "It may be said that the Jewish mystics recovered the mythical dimension of a biblical motif regarding the appearance of God in the guise of the highest of angels, called angel of the Lord, angel of God, or angel of the presence, which sometimes appeared in the form of a man. Evidence for the continuity, note this, for the continuity of the exegetical tradition of an exalted angel that is in effect the manifestation of God is to be found in a wide variety of later sources." So now you have Jews before the time of Christ, contemporary with the time of Christ, during the construction of the Talmud, and now even still into the medieval period. You have Jews still believing these things. Here is another article in the Harvard Theological Review, this one not by Boyarin, but by Daniel Abrams. It's called "The Boundaries of Divine Ontology, the Inclusion and Exclusion of Metatron in the Godhead." Metatron was a name that was given by some Jews to refer to the figure called the angel of the Lord. And the sources on this, there's all kinds of stuff going on. But notice what he says here. He says, in a tradition from the Sar Torah material of the Hekkelot texts, Metatron, these are Jewish texts, Metatron is described as Metatron, Lord God of Israel, God of the heavens and the earth. In the Book of Illumination, written by the first known Kabbalist in Castile, Rabbi Yaakov ben Yaakov HaKohen, Metatron is called Logos, word. Here's another quote from Abrams. "This approach to the Pardes account in general," the Pardes account is an account of certain Jews, including Rabbi Akiva, who see paradise. And in that account, Rabbi Akiva identifies a second divine person in the vision. He identifies as God, and in the Talmud, he has to be rebuked for it and all this. But and Rabbi Akiva, by the way, was one of the greatest rabbis of the ancient period. But anyways, it says, "This approach to the Pardes account in general and the role of Metatron in particular can be found in the works of some Kabbalists beginning in the early 13th century. Although it may seem that we are reading a rabbinic text," so the medieval or the 2nd to 5th century, "although it may seem that we are reading a rabbinic text through the lens of the Kabbalistic worldview, so medieval Jews, the understanding of the continuous or organic being of the divine, which extends from the simple unity of the Godhead to a hypostatic manifestation, predates much of the Talmud." So he's saying that what you see in some of these later medieval Jews is not so much a departure from what was being advocated by the Talmudists, but rather is something that preceded the Talmudic rabbis. And what is it that preceded? This idea that there is a continuous or organic relationship between these members of the Godhead, the manifestation identified as the angel of the Lord. Here's another passage. It says, in the passage from Nachmanides, so Nachmanides was another famous medieval rabbi, just like Nachmanides was called Rambam, Nachmanides is called Ramban. So it says, in the passage from Nachmanides' commentary to the Torah discussed by Pines, Nachmanides explicitly takes issue with Maimonides and with the 10th century sage Saida Gaon by inference, and seeks to characterize the fundamental difference between his tradition and Maimonides' Aristotelian worldview. So he's saying that Nachmanides took issue with Maimonides because he had imbibed too much of Aristotelian philosophy. He goes on to say the difference between Nachmanides and Maimonides centers around the inclusion or exclusion of the divine manifestation within the Godhead. Nachmanides posits an organic or continuous relationship between God's being and that of the angel, that is, the angel of the Lord. That is, they are both immanent in the same divine substance. This sounds exactly like Nicaea. What is it doing in Jewish sources as those of Nachmanides, whose Jewish bona fides can't be questioned? Here's Moshe Idel, another Jewish scholar, in his book Son, or Ben, excuse me, which means son, subtitled Sonship and Jewish Mysticism. Look what he says. He says, there can be little doubt, however, that early Jewish theologumena related to such a hypostatic or supernal, this is what he's talking about in context. He says, there can be little doubt, however, that early Jewish theologumena related to such a son existed, as the books dealing with Enoch, in particular the Ethiopian one, and Philo's views concerning the Logos as son or firstborn convincingly demonstrate. And likewise, there can be little doubt that they inform the main developments in a great variety of the nascent Christologies. In the course of time, due to the ascent in Christianity of both the centrality and cruciality of sonship understood in diverse forms of incarnation, it seems that Jewish authors belonging to rabbinic circles attenuated and in some cases even obliterated the sole role of sons as cosmic mediators. Nevertheless, some of these earlier traditions about divine sonship apparently survived in traditional Jewish writings that were subsequently transmitted by rabbinic Judaism. Yet there's no reason to assume that only the literary corpora adopted by rabbinic Judaism mediated the late antiquity views of theophoric sonship to the more extensive corpora written in the Middle Ages, or that sonship only survived in the written documents. Okay, so I just quoted one scholar after another, most of them Jewish, pointing out that belief in a plurality of divine persons in the Godhead preceded, coincided with, followed, even into the medieval period in Judaism. This is not something out of court. It was firmly entrenched in Judaism, so firmly entrenched, first of all, that during the Second Temple period, as Boyarin says, it was popular Judaism. This is what the vast majority of Jews believed. Only after the time of Christ, when it became dangerous to continue to affirm this, it played into the hands of Christianity. Only then do you begin to see a reaction against this. And even with this Herculean effort on the part of the Talmudic rabbis, it continued to persist in certain Jewish circles. Well, on top of that, I could quote person after person showing not only that Jews believed in a plurality of divine persons on the basis of the biblical text, but even in some cases believed that one of those divine persons was going to come into the world and was in fact going to be the Messiah. Here is Jacob Neusner, one of the most prolific authors, certainly in our time, but he's certainly in the running. I don't know who's written the most books in history, but Neusner, last I knew, had written over like 800 books. Don't believe me? Go check it out. Neusner was a prolific author and a Jew. Jacob Neusner, in his book Judaisms, already tips his hand there, showing you that Judaism has not been monolithic. Judaisms and their messiahs at the turn of the Christian era. Note what he says about the messianic expectation of earlier times. He says, earlier systems of Judaism resorted to the myth, and he defines myth not so much as something false, but as the idea of certain people, right? Whether, it's believed or not. I mean, but he's saying these people believed it. He's saying earlier systems of Judaism resorted to the myth of the Messiah as savior and redeemer of Israel, a supernatural figure, even a God-man, facing the crucial historical questions of Israel's life and resolving them. The Christ as king of the world, of the ages, of death itself. So Neusner says that earlier Jews believed that the Messiah would be a God-man. Here's Moshe Idel again in his book, Messianic Mystics. He says, in some instances, the Messiah has been conceived also as the representative of the divine into this world. The very fact that the phrase Mashiach Yahweh, notice Messiah Jehovah, recurs in the sources shows a special connection between him and God. This nexus could sometimes be stronger and richer as it later became in Christian theology, in the ecstatic Kabbalah and Sabbateanism, or less evidently in some other cases in Jewish sources, though such a view is found also in the rabbinic literature, where the Messiah is described as one of the three entities designated by the Tetragrammaton, the divine name. One of the three entities designated by the Tetragrammaton. Here is John Collins in his book, The Scepter and the Star, talking about Messianism in light of the Dead Sea Scrolls. With respect to what they reveal, he says, we shall find, in the course of this study, we shall find four basic messianic paradigms. Messiah as king, priest, prophet, and heavenly Messiah. It should say priest, but anyways. And they were not equally widespread. That is all these different expectations of the Messiah. He says, admittedly, the heavenly Messiah paradigm is somewhat different from the others, since it's not defined by function and can overlap with the other paradigms. So in other words, you find in the literature an expectation of a Messiah who's portrayed in a kingly way, or in a priestly way, or in a prophetic way, and also in a heavenly way. And it's not always clear what relationship all these have to each other. He says, but it's certainly the case, and when we talk about a heavenly Messiah, that it doesn't have to be viewed as a discrete thing. It could, the kingly Messiah or priestly Messiah or prophetic Messiah may well just be the heavenly Messiah. In other words, he's viewed as a heavenly person who's come into the world as king or priest or prophet or all three. He goes on to say on pages 19 through 20, there were other paradigms of messianism besides the Davidic one, and some elements of these were found to be applicable to the Christian Messiah. We shall find also texts that envisage exaltation and enthronement in heaven, and texts that apply certain attributes of divinity to a messianic figure.